All right. You retired from Georgetown yesterday. Last year. Okay. Congratulations. I won't delay any further since we are a little bit late, but we do plan to finish at about 5:15. And then after that, we're going to have Usher Prayer, which you are more than welcome to participate in or observe if you would like. So without any further delay, our three speakers, and we're going to start with Dr. Ustad Shadi Imam to do a brief intro.
Bismillah. Everybody hear me? I've been called many things in life. Quiet is not one of them. So what I'd like to do is let's ask everybody to come forward. Yeah, it's a nice intimate gathering. We can have a nice conversation. So if everybody comes forward, that way we can see your name tags and call you out in class. Just kidding. We won't do that. Yeah, exactly. I appreciate everybody coming. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise is due to Allah, God, the Lord of the worlds. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the merciful and the mercy-giving. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. May his peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad and his family, and actually indeed upon all of the prophets before him. Just out of curiosity, how many people, is this your first time at the Adams Center? Wow, okay, excellent. So welcome to the Adams Center. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to walk around, see some of the exhibits that we have today, meet some of the Muslims. It's really exciting to have you here. And for those, of course, that are repeat offenders, just kidding, coming into the mosque, it's really nice having you as well. As Brother Omar mentioned, my name is Shad Imam. I am a local, kind of born and bred community member here from Adams Center, very proudly so, actually. And now, over the years, have been teaching various and sundry classes at the Adams Center under the kind of tutelage of Imam Majid, who's our Imam here, as well as Sheikh Abdul Rafi, who is one of our main teachers, and many other community members that I've benefited from over time. Really interesting, just as an introduction, I went and graduated from Herndon High School here down the street, nearly 30 years ago this year. And I remember in 1992, yeah, I'm aging myself, when I first started, up until that point in my education, history really it started more or less around 1604, right? That's more or less when it started, because that's when Virginia was discovered. And so we started Virginia histories, and I had that through 5th grade and 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. I remember we did a whole presentation on General George Armstrong Custer's last stand, and I was very familiar with American history. And it wasn't until 9th grade in my world civilization class at Herndon High School that I actually studied history that was no longer American, right? Like in terms of, okay, I'm used to Virginian history, I'm used to kind of the colonial history and, all of that stuff. But now I was learning about the Tudors in England, and I was learning about the Whigs and the Tories, and I was learning about the monarchies of England. And then there was one chapter that I recall very vividly midway through the year on Islam. And I kid you not, I felt very seen. I was like, yes, there is something of my heritage in this world civilization class. And so in 9th grade, I remember taking that class, doing that chapter, and that was it. I didn't hear anything else about Islam until a couple months later when we actually did one chapter, mind you, on African civilization. And there happened to be one African Muslim, the only one that I can recall to my date, Mansa Musa, that I remember studying. So for me, it was almost like the entire corpus of history studies in America in high school at this period of time consisted of knowing that there was Muhammad, who started Islam. There was Saladin, who was a general for the Muslims during the Crusades. And then there was Mansa Musa, who was the richest, kind of millionaire, billionaire, trillionaire, if you will, whatever, in the world. And that was it. And then I went through another 3 years of history, or of high school, never hearing anything about Islam again. In the meantime, we learned all about the Renaissance. In the meantime, we learned all about the European civilizations, how they flourished, what they did, how they came to America, what happened. And it was not for me personally until college that I had any sense of what happened during that 1,000-year period between 600 of the Common Era, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came onto the scene, until 1609, when Islam entered, or when the slaves came to Virginia, or were brought to Virginia, right? Like that, there was just a huge question mark in my mind.
You probably didn't know that Thomas Jefferson owned a Quran.
That's true. I discovered that 4 years after college, actually. So the reason I bring this up is because I recently was reading a book. I was just telling Dr. Douglas, I was recently reading a book, and there was a line in the book by Yusuf Islam, who is a formerly known as Cat Stevens, very famous rock artist from 1970s. And he said the faith of 1/4 of humanity is so hidden in the West, it's basically invisible. There are over 2 billion people in the world that profess the faith of Islam, and yet what do we know about Islamic civilization here in the West? It's very minimal. So today, inshallah, through the presentations and through some of the discussions we'll have, we're going to try and shed some light as to what was Islam doing during this period of time before the 19th century. Right? Where did it exist? And what did it produce? So without any further ado, I'd like to begin with our dear esteemed speaker, Dr. Susan Douglas, to begin with her presentation, inshallah.
Oh, I can do it that way? Okay, that's good.
No, that's for switching between the presentations.
Oh, okay. All right, so I should use the up and down?
The left and right.
Oh, okay. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome those of you who are here for the first time. I'm going to go one better than him because I graduated earlier than that in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was nothing about Islam. And if there was, it was in the Crusades, and maybe I was looking out the window at the time. But there wasn't really anything at all. And then on top of that, I majored in history at the University of Rochester, and they were well known for being innovative in teaching history, and lots of developments at the time, and I was looking for things about sort of the world and world history. That's my field now, is world history. And I learned nothing about Islam in college, in 4 years of college. So then I went overseas. I lived in Berlin for a while. My background's German. I was curious about it, but I graduated a couple times into a recession, so I went to Berlin to sort of see what was happening. Anyway, and so then I ran into Muslims for the first time. I wasn't aware of any on my campus at that time. So then I'm like, okay, so I accepted Islam based on reading and meeting people and so on. And I'm like, but then what happened? How did we get here from there? What is Islamic history? And so I've been at that ever since then. And I have dedicated myself anyway to teaching, so if you're going to learn, you're going to teach. And so I've been developing curriculum on Islam and Muslims and all kinds of matters related to that, and doing outreach for educators as well, for Muslims as well as in public schools. I've worked with Fairfax County. You were lucky that you were in a school that had world history, because not everyone has all. So I'm going to talk about the issues, and I'll have to tell another story that I was telling Shad. That I was teaching this. I don't know if any of you are aware of the Islamic Saudi Academy. Was opened in like 1985. It was a big school run by the Saudis. They had lots of resources. They drew people from all over the area. And when I arrived here after 12 years overseas, I ended up teaching there. And I kind of Mrs. Social Studies. I taught things from 3rd grade all the way straight to high school, all different subjects as they were developed resource centers and so on. And I also began writing curriculum. So when I needed to do like more study because I needed to know more, so I started my graduate study at Georgetown in 1990, and I came back to the school to do special presentations. And I'm in a 6th grade class where they start studying world history, and this young girl was sitting in the front row, and I was talking about the science and the astronomy and the medicine and all this stuff, and she stopped me, and I'm not sure exactly how polite it was, but one way or another she got through to me. She said, "You're just saying that because you're Muslim." And I suppose the choices would have been send her to the principal, something about upside the head, I don't know, but I didn't, and I went out of that presentation saying, you know what, she's right. how are we going to explain to people? It's got to be show me, don't tell me. Don't just give me an alternative narrative. Give me the story of how did that algebra and that medicine and all those things. And so that's what this presentation is going to be about. And it's not just about the, those simple things, but we're going to look at a whole series of different types of interactions that happened between Islam and Muslims and the West. And it starts out this way. First of all, we have to think about the fact that if we're looking at Islam-European relations or Muslims' relations with Europeans, it's really because if you look at a map, and we will do that shortly, it's a hinge, regionally, geographically. Islam was a hinge between Europe and the rest of what we now call Afro-Eurasia. We don't just call it Europe and Asia and Africa, we call it Afro-Eurasia because they're all connected, and where they're not connected by land, they're connected by the oceans, by sea travel. So this had two effects. One of them is that Islam and Christianity were somewhat in competition with one another during history. They both were spreading at the same time, by the way, in the 4th to the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and parallel to one another. And also, they were, you could say in competition because they're very close to one another. Right? So that means we're kind of competing for adherence and for understanding and things like that. And the medium at the time where Muslims were in Spain, there was a lot of direct contact, but otherwise the medium of contact was through officials like the church, right? They would be having to explain or translate to people. So anyway, the beginning of this contact has to do with the spread of Islam. And there's got to be one thing that I try to make clear that we're here. While we're here. It's very common to say that there was something called the rapid spread or the rapid expansion of Islam. Right? That is not really true. First of all, because a religion is not a balloon. It doesn't expand. It's a tradition carried by people, right? What happened, however, was that in history there were conquests, that's certainly very clear. The territory under Muslim rule expanded quite rapidly. In the 1st century after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the territory under Muslim rule expanded from the Atlantic Ocean basically to the borders of China, right? But the second process, which is completely distinct, different people, different everything, was the gradual spread of Islam, which, as historians now know, took between 2 and 4 centuries before it spread widely among the people. And during that time, Muslims were living as a minority in the early period, and they were, living alongside Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and Buddhists and Hindus, which continued to exist in those Muslim territories. So it was not just, a map that suddenly turned green, from one end to the other. That's not a good way of thinking about it. But Islam did spread quite widely, and as you can see, one of the major reasons for these interactions were that Islam is a universal religion with a simple message. Arabic was a language like Latin, corresponding to Latin in the West, and it was widely used in scholarship and trade and so on. And the other thing that is important is that it became a civilization quite rapidly, and that the 5 pillars stimulated science. You had to be able to find the direction of Mecca from any location. So this made people actually need to solve mathematical problems. You had to determine the calendar by, some prowess in astronomy. And the rapid expansion stimulated geography. That's only one of the things. But the other thing as a hinge civilization that occurred is that Muslims became, Islam as a civilization was an open society that was willing to take in content from the world's heritage at that time, and very literally did so in the form of people communicating their knowledge, and also in the form of translations of books that came in and then were translated in this big effort, and we'll talk about that. Also, another important factor is that cities grew with its urbanization is a very important factor in the spread of Islam in these territories, that is to say, the spread of Islam among the people. and also the communication that was stimulated by the annual Hajj. That's only one factor, but there were many reasons why people did travel. And so through all this kind of nexus and the region in which they were, Islam really became a hinge not only to absorb knowledge from other societies, but also to transmit it in all directions. And we're talking mostly now about the connection between Islam, or interactions about Islam and Europeans, mainly because the later history kind of says, and I always make a joke with my students, that Europeans woke up one day and invented everything. That didn't happen. In fact, what Europeans did was to build upon a foundation for modernity that came from the last 1,500 years at least, and if you want to go back even farther, of accumulated human knowledge, which passed into civilizations in various ways and was preserved and so on. So that's kind of the foundation. There is the map that I mentioned, in which case you can see exactly, how it was a hinge, and you can also see the trade routes that connected this. These are not Islamic trade routes. They were traversed by Muslims, but they predated Islam, but they became very active at that time. They weren't just the trade routes of an empire where, soldiers went out and taxes came in. That's not how it was. They were widely used, and they were supportive of the urbanization that took place, and they were also quite frequently used and expanding all the time and intensive. You just see the major routes here, but they were at a very fine-grained level. Okay, so one of the things that we often do hear about is that there was a transfer of knowledge between Muslim civilization, and I don't use the word Arab civilization or Arabic, but when you say Arabic, it means that the medium of exchange of translation was Arabic language as a universal language. So there's this idea that Muslims preserved, and it's quite true, Muslims preserved the knowledge that came in from many sources, whether India or China or Central Asia in particular, and from the Greek and Roman traditions of literacy. And so Islam, as this kind of hinge, was preserving this knowledge and building upon it during this period of time between, say, the 8th century and the 15th century. And I'm not saying it stopped at that point, but it was definitely being translated and built upon during that period of time. And we're going to talk about how that actually took place and what other fields it happened. But there's this idea that after the Roman Empire fell in Europe, that knowledge kind of disappeared. Cities, declined in number and frequency, and learning, kind of was a little bit snuffed out. So this knowledge, the heritage particularly of Greece and Rome, was preserved in the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, but not so much in the West. But when the Renaissance came along, and how many of you have heard about this thing called the Renaissance in Europe? It means a rebirth of knowledge, okay? So there's this idea that this knowledge of the previous, Western civilization is looking for its origins, and talks about how this knowledge has been lost, and then in the Renaissance it was discovered. Well, how? Who? Where? Was it just kind of lying around and someone found it under a tree? People have often said it happened during the Crusades. Not so much. The Crusaders were not generally literate folks. And did it happen also, was it that the monks kind of preserved it and then came one day and opened the boxes and took it out again? No. There was a reason why it happened. Why did it reappear, when and where, and what kind of knowledge actually was it? Who created, preserved it, and transferred this knowledge to Europe? So you could look at a kind of a diagram, and you could put this diagram on its side and make it not just geographically dynamic, but also chronological, so that the events that happened here happened over several centuries. It's really just kind of showing you how knowledge moved into Islam and how it then moved outside and how it made its way to Europe through very concrete things like books being bought and sold, libraries being developed, universities being developed in both Europe and in Muslim lands, okay? So one of the institutions, and this is a kind of a double translation idea that you have to kind of grasp in order to understand the process by which this happened. In the early Abbasid period, in the 9th century, 8th and 9th century, we had something founded called the Beit al-Hikmah, which may have been one institution, was probably multiple institutions, but the more important thing about it is that it was a process that was funded by scholars. It was supported also by government grants, and by most particularly for Muslims here, by Awqaf, which are dedicated funds, in the name of Allah to do certain work. And so what happened was books from Greek and from Persian and from Sanskrit and other languages came into the possession of the Muslims at this time and were paid to be translated. There was an effort that was well supported to translate these books into Arabic, okay? And that was the Bayt al-Hikmah. At the very same time, subhanAllah, paper-making technology had arrived along Central Asia in the Muslim lands and arrived as manufacturing paper, by the way, in Baghdad around this time. Okay, so that's really important because before, and I used to tell my students, if you wanted to write a book, you needed to kill a flock of sheep, right? As parchment was what you did. Papyrus doesn't last very long, it's very brittle. And so paper-making technology was an extra boost that allowed the dissemination of these materials. They were still being written by hand as manuscripts, but they were having a medium that was flexible, durable, and so on for books. This is showing you paper making, and also, by the way, shows you in this diagram how they were using water power to pound the pulp. So this was a time when they were using, a kind of energy, not just human or animal muscle. So this learning, once it was translated, was stored in libraries. There was a huge proliferation of libraries, and it was carried across these different, from city to city. There were book markets called Suq al-Waraqin for all kinds of literacy. And among the things that were translated that moved, I have a quote that is basically all of the collection of human scientific knowledge from all these sources. You could list, geometry, botany, pharmacology, medicine, astronomy, mathematics. All of these things are among those works that were translated when they came into the awareness of the Muslims during the early Abbasid period. Okay, so you can see examples here of all of those. And these are the pathways by which then this knowledge came to Europe. One of those pathways was Spain. That turned out to be the main one. Spain and Sicily were both the main ones, one of them in Sicily particularly for the study of medicine, and in Spain when the city of Toledo we have in Ohio, but Toledo was in Spain, happened to have been conquered, but because the people who quote-unquote conquered it or moved into it to rule it were Spaniards, Christians, but who knew and understood the wealth and the value of what was in those libraries. They didn't come in and, set up bonfires and stuff like that. No. And one in particular has earned the name Alfonso the Wise, who here and now we have our parallel translation effort taking place in Spain in the 12th century. 1085 is when Toledo fell, and during the following century, at least, you had people coming to translate these works. I hope so. All right. I promised I wouldn't make a joke about the time, but I did. Okay, and so you have a third arrow here toward the east, which is from Ottoman lands into Eastern Europe, and my colleague will be talking more about that because I'm only going up to a certain period. And I have just a couple of minutes to go, but one of the important things is if you have translations, you have to have people who want to do that translation, and there had to be multiple people. Some who spoke Latin, some who spoke Spanish, some who spoke Arabic or Hebrew. So translations were made among multiple languages, and a lot of vocabulary came in. If you look at a list of Spanish words, you can just do a word cloud and see all those different fields in cuisine and clothing and textiles and all those things that were words that came in directly from Arabic during that time. But they have to also be received, and so this was a time when urbanization was coming back in Europe, and when there was the ability to have more learning outside the church. People wanted to know more about architecture and trade and all sorts of different fields to sort of build up. They got a thirst for learning. And these are the people who came to Spain to translate and who also then carried these works across the Pyrenees into Europe and where they began to take root, okay? This is, and I know I just have a minute or two left and I've got lots more to show you, but this is a painting that recognizes the importance of that learning that did transfer into Europe. This is Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the main writers who worked on this issue of faith versus revelation, or revelation versus reason, and who sort of sorted it out. And he was building upon the work of one Ibn Rushd, who was a philosopher who commented on the translations of Aristotle. And so you see him depicted here along with sort of the transformation of knowledge that was taking place from the medieval period to the Renaissance. And here you have another one. This is a kind of more open painting. You kind of see how this was sort of a medieval, type of painting, type of thinking, type of education. And here in the Renaissance, you see this sort of opening up. There's Plato and Aristotle walking together like two buddies, and among the people who are curiously talking to each other in this kind of marketplace is good old Ibn Rushd right here, along with several others, mathematicians that you can identify there. Right? So then we have, and this is probably the farthest I'll be able to get today with this, is that there was an impact in the 12th century. It came to be called the 12th century Renaissance. But then there was another time when the impact of these translated works into Latin from Arabic actually had a major impact. I don't know if my thing went off here or what happened. It should still be working. Fell off, I guess, is what happened. Sorry about that. So the second impact that's extremely important here is that the era of printing appeared in 1450s. And I actually came in possession of a book that listed all of the scientific works that were printed in the first century of printing. And they were, in fact, if you saw that, I had a list of about 65 or 70 works that were printed in Europe in the first century of printing that were about the sciences. It said what sciences they were about. And it listed the translators who had done the work in Spain. So they were then printed. So you had the 12th century into the 15th century. There's 3 centuries. Things took a long time in those days. But they then picked these books up, and then they also became one of the first industries that was involving investment, was printing. And so there was a sale, there was a demand for these books. So when you look at the scientists working in Europe in the century, Copernicus and various other people, you would find that the books that they had on their bookshelves, and libraries were growing a great deal, obviously, in the first century of printing, they were looking at the books that had been translated in medicine, in astronomy, in mathematics, in botany, in every field you can imagine, right? And they actually wrote about it. So Copernicus acknowledges astronomers like Al-Tusi in their work and various other ones. And the Qanun of Ibn Sina in medicine, the Canon of Medicine, was printed straight up into the 18th century. And that's what this book contained. When was it printed? Where was it printed? All over Europe, these books were printed. And so that is like the second major and important impact. And there are whole lots of other areas that I'd love to share with you, but we ran out of time here. But I wanted you to be aware because, again, there are so many different ways in which this is misunderstood. When did it happen? How did this transfer happen? And our schools, in the time you took it, used to just kind of say, well, here's what we got from them. Well, how? Did it fly? Did it, fall out of the sky? No, there were people, individuals you can name they were doing that we can know where did it happen, when did it happen, and who were the agents that made this happen, okay? So I could go into a bunch of other things, but I have to yield my time in textiles, in all sorts of other fields. Maybe we'll get to those in the Q&A. So I yield my time.
Assalamu alaikum. You guys hear me? Microphone works? Mic check? All right, excellent. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. So I want to just thank Dr. Douglas for her presentation and actually for her pioneering work. And I'm not using that term lightly, but to have a historian of her background and her caliber, having really gone into and done the research to uncover the types of things that 30 years ago were very novel, that I hope through forums like this become more normative and much more accessible, if you will. Today, inshallah, I only have a few minutes. So what I wanted to do was use this opportunity as a teaser for the people that are in this room to really how we can find out more about what Dr. Douglas was talking about. In 2019, there was a book published called The Map of Knowledge. The Map of Knowledge. It's by Violet Muller. And it's a really fantastic book in which she actually takes 3 ancient texts, right, we'll get into which ones they are, and maps them from how it was that they survived from Alexander the Great's time until the modern era. And that's why she calls it the map of knowledge, because she identified through the work of the translators that Dr. Douglas was talking about how knowledge transferred in the world in the pre-modern time, before AI, before the West, before all of the stuff that we have today, right? Things took time, they took people, and frankly, they took some miracles along the way, right? That's what you learn in this process. So, the 3 texts that she mentions, and probably for many of the students here, if you've been through high school or public education, you know these names. Euclid, yes, Euclidean geometry, right? Who published the Elements around 300 of before Christ. Ptolemy's Almagest, which was about 150 in the Common Era, and Galen's medical works around that same time period, also in the Common Era. So these are 3 ancient texts. Now, the first 2 found themselves, actually all 3 of them found themselves in the Library of Alexandria in the early centuries after Christ. Right? And that was very important because that library itself was kind of the... actually, I think I've got a slide coming up. Sorry, I went backwards somehow. 1 second, guys. Sorry about that. Yes, so when you go into the first library in Alexandria, this had about 700,000 scrolls and really was the sum of all human knowledge up until that point. Now, what we'll discover in this journey is that there are basically 7 distinct cities or points within the world that became what would become the map of knowledge, right? This, by the way, this map is roughly from about the time of Pope Leo at the advent of the Crusades. It happened to be a map that showed all the cities in that area, which is why I took it from his works. So we start off in Alexandria, and then within a short period of time, after the advent of Islam, actually in what Dr. Douglas was talking about, we end up with the Bayt al-Hikmah, those homes, or literally the centers of knowledge in Baghdad. There was massive translation work that was happening, and these projects from the state, as she mentioned, it wasn't just about preserving knowledge, it was about really new knowledge on top of that. It was analyzing what Euclid was talking about, analyzing what Aristotle was talking about, analyzing what these people, and then correcting them where they were wrong. So the Muslims actually had innovation in this sense, and again, it stems from the fact that knowledge is part of our deen. In fact, she even mentions in her book that the very first revelation that was given to the Prophet Muhammad was read. In other words, to recite. Right? So she takes us in this journey from Baghdad, and she mentions, actually, we mentioned some of these scholars today, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, Al-Kindi, Al-Khawarizmi. Right? When I use that name, my kids in particular know who that is because he is the creator of algebra. So people either love him or they hate him, depending on how they're doing in algebra, right? But literally his book on Al-Jabr al-Muqabala, the equating of one thing to another, he actually mentions in that, just a fun fact on this, in the entire mathematical book is written in Arabic. And in order to reference the unknown, he uses the word shay'un. In Arabic, shay'un means thing. So he says, when you're solving for the thing, this is what you have to do in an equation, right? Translators from Al-Khawarizmi, which is in Persia, that's where Al-Khawarizmi is located, right? From his time, those works through the Muslim universities across North Africa, including Ibn Khaldun, where he studied himself in Qarawiyyin, the translation work started and made its path all the way to Spain. Now, the Spanish translators that were looking at these Arabic texts, they said, hey, we need to translate shay'un, right? This thing, the unknown. Well, how do we do that? Because in Spanish, guess what letter you don't have? Sheen. The sh sound is not a common Spanish sound. And so the translators ran into a problem, literally a lexical problem with how do we translate shay'un into Spanish? So what they did was they borrowed a letter from the Greeks. They borrowed the sound chi. Anybody know what a chi looks like in Greek? An X. The reason we use X for the unknown is because there was no sheen for shay'un in Spanish. The Arabic translators had to adopt and borrow something from a different language, and today the legacy of that is something we still, all of our math students know that's something that's practiced, right, in algebra. So this is how knowledge traversed centuries and time, and eventually found itself, as I mentioned, into Qurtuba, which there's a lot that can be written and said about Qurtuba. So again, just because of our time today, I wanted to just give you some highlights of this. But Qurtuba, just by example, it was said to have had over 500,000 inhabitants at one time in this city. The people that visited Qurtuba called it the ornament of the world at that time, that for 7 miles in any direction outside the city, you could see light and lanterns that were burning at night on their own, automated, if you will, right? This was a kind of sophistication within the city, but one thing that was prized on was its libraries. And actually, she mentions in the book that it almost became a point where the wealthy people were competing with each other for books to try and make sure that they had libraries that had those books, even if they couldn't read them, just in order to have them. Eventually, from Qurtuba, we moved to Toledo, which at this point in history has fallen into the Christian kingdoms. Gotcha. And then, in Toledo, you end up having these interfaith teams set up of Muslims, Jews, and Christians all working together to translate texts. And in fact, some of the texts, they would be translated in one sitting from Arabic to Spanish to Latin. So you see that happening in one sitting. They would take a text and say, okay, all you scholars, sit down for the next 4 days. This is all we're going to work on, right? And this was a very powerful kind of methodology. And then eventually, those works over the centuries, especially after the 12th century, find themselves in Italy, in the cities of Salerno, which is technically Sicily, and then Palermo, and eventually finding its way to Venice. Now, of course, Venice becomes kind of, in Italy in particular, becomes the advent of the Renaissance, the renewal, which was actually, in the Muslim world, is just the continuation, right? Because if we were already, that renewal had already happened 1,000 years before in terms of how to take these knowledges from the Greco-Roman times and translate them into technology and innovation in the modern era. Now, we have lots of luminaries, and I'll just give you some names. I mentioned earlier Al-Khawarizmi. There's Hunayd ibn Ishaq, Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina is one of the most famous medical professionals, along with a whole bunch of other things. I was always amazed when I studied these personalities that they believed in science as one unit. So they didn't just become a specialist in astronomy. They became a specialist in all sciences. And then they would write works and contribute to that. In Ibn Sina's case, it was in medicine in particular. His medical book became the standard textbook for about 700 years in Europe until the 18th century, actually 19th century. It was still being used. So it's just, one thing, if you take nothing else from kind of this, realize that knowledge has always been core to Muslims, especially for some of the reasons that Dr. Douglas mentioned, for instance, the Qibla. Right? Being able to pray towards Mecca requires you to know where you are in the world and how that works. Abu Rayhan al-Bayruni, for instance, he wanted to make sure that he had a time he had a place in the world where using one longitude without a latitude, you could calculate the Qibla direction. How did he do this? He did this by climbing to the top of a mountain, measuring the dip angle of the earth angle at which it starts to curve, and then deducing what the hypotenuse was, giving us the radius to the center of the earth and its entire circumference. This is in a time when many people in the medieval and dark ages of Europe still believed the world to be flat. Somebody asked Abu Rayhan al-Bayruni, how do you know that the world is spherical? His response was, have you ever seen its shadow during an eclipse? It was actually a very easy answer. He's like, if the shadow of the earth were a square, we would see it as such during an eclipse. But we don't, because it's spherical, right? So, I mean, they use their knowledge in this type of way. Now, the contribution, that we had in civilization, again, just to highlight here, the Renaissance itself, European Renaissance, and you could actually argue modernity was not spontaneous. It developed over time. And alhamdulillah, now, by the grace of Allah, we have lots of works and texts that talk about that. Inshallah, hopefully we'll have some seminars in the future where we can go in details into things that Dr. Douglas was talking about. But at this time, I'd like to ask our final speaker, Brother Amir Muhammad, to come forward and talk a little bit more about Islam in the Americas in particular. Recognizing, by the way, we've just touched on one part of the world. We haven't talked about Islam in China, Southeast Asia, or Africa, which has a direct impact upon the Muslims here in America.
While he sits down, I just want to say that the word algorithm that's killing us all on social media actually is the neighborhood. It's for fun.
All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. I'm going to be quick, try to be precise, cover 600-700 years, okay? But the topic was knowledge and education. And after the Spanish Inquisition, it came to West Africa. It was the Portuguese was the first group of Europeans that enslaved us, as well as the Spaniards. They enslaved us because of our knowledge of growing rice, growing cotton, indigo, our knowledge of tearing down the woods and preparing, and that's what they brought us over there for. We're famous for the rice development. That was just the wave of the timeline when we came. They talk about when Christopher Columbus came. There's reports that he's found Muslims in Panama, Cuba, and Haiti, and other parts of the world. They talked about Mansa Musa and their travels coming over here. In our history, we talk about Mansa Musa and the West Africans. We also talk about the Chinese brothers that came here in 1421. This is a DVD talking about the Chinese coming over here and traveling. This is an article talking about Christopher Columbus and what he wrote down when he found. We talked about the Spanish, the history talks about the Spanish Inquisition, how we came from Spain into West Africa. And this is a map that covers that. I'm going to kind of be quick. A couple of points I want to bring out. Estebanico is one of the first Muslims that's known with credited with discovering Arizona and New Mexico. It came with the Spaniards after the Spanish Inquisition. In Puerto Rico, there's a fort called the Fort of the Moors. And the Fort of the Moors, on the walls that's facing the ocean, you got this Arabic script written on it. As well as in the downtown in Old San Juan, there's a restaurant that has this Arabic script written on it. You'll see the Islamic architect all throughout the Caribbeans, but because the Muslims, anywhere that the Spaniards had, they took it from the Muslims. And once the Spaniards lost it, they lost it to the Dutch. The Dutch lost it to the British or the Americans. So our story was starting not to be told as much. When Muslims came here, they became known as Melungeons. They live in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee, Kentucky. They say the Abraham Lincoln mother was a Melungeons. Elvis Presley mother was a Melungeons. And these Appalachian people still live there today. The Melungeons became known as the unwanted people. Lived in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky. There's many different books that talk about them and their arrival here. Another unique thing, Brooklyn, New York, was settled and accessed by a European Muslim, Anthony Van Jameson. His father was Salih. In Morocco, there's a town called Salih, Morocco, that's named after him as a pirate. He's credited with discovering Brooklyn, the first European in Brooklyn. His name was Anthony Van Jameson. The Vanderbilts, Jacqueline Onassis are descendants from this Anthony Van Jameson. And these two are Muslims on the bottom today, from descendants from that family. You got stories of Nazarene, Egyptian brother who married a Native American Indian. California got his name from a woman named Queen Latifah. And there's records that you go in and find it. Talk about the Moors coming in here, arriving in here. Closer to our area, you have Matthew de Sosa. You got the Sosa Bridge. There's a tribe in West Africa called the Sosa tribe. You have stories of the Moors and their rivals coming in here in the early 1600s. The law of the land stated that if you was a Moor or a Turk and your country got a relationship with the King of England, you got the right to be free. You can't own slaves, but you got the right to be free. And there's documents how they petitioned the government for their freedom. These are people that lived in Delaware, lived amongst the Nagaco Indians, still exist today. There's many different reports about indigenous people, Muslims, Moors, Guineas, living all throughout the United States. And these are some of the names about it. Then who has heard about the Lasso Mohegans, Indians. The Lasso Mohegans Indian, Uncas, his tombstone is there, and his son's tombstone, which is named Muhammad. I got 10 minutes. I'm going to speed up because I think there's some points. I'm not going to. This is African civilization that were Muslims during the times, 1800s, 1700s. A lot of times they told us that Africans couldn't read and write. We had no history, we had no culture. But Islam was there. They could read and write. They didn't understand what they could read and write. And from this is a map about the slave trade, how they brought us into South America, the Caribbeans, and southern parts of the United States, and some parts of Europe is a map. And the reason why I want to, and these are some of the different tribes that they brought us in. There's quite a few different museums that are around that tells the story of the African-American Muslims. If you ever heard of the Gullah or the Geechee people out of South Carolina and Georgia people, these people have Islamic roots, and they had Islamic traditions. These are some personalities that are well known. You can see in the exhibit, Job ibn Dijallo. You call them the fortunate slave. This was a young Muslim that came here at the age of 8. When he passed away, he owned 100 acres of land. He brought his children's freedom and as well as his wife's freedom. This here is a petition in 1753. It was written in Arabic, and it was a Jewish one that did the translation. And there was a personality named Abdul Khanner and Mahmud Muhammad petitioned the government all in Arabic for their freedom. And it became known as the Moorish Sun-Dry Act because the law of the land stated that if your country had a relationship with the King of England, you got the right to be free. You can't own slaves, but you got the right to be free. This is one of the earliest letters written in Arabic. It's the Al-Fatiha and 3 of the last surahs of the Kul surahs. This is Kunta Kinte, American story about a Muslim being enslaved here and wanted to maintain his Islamic identity. One of his children's name was, grandchildren was Chicken George, and this is Chicken George, dressed in a robe. You go to the Alexandria Museum, they tell you he's in his pajamas. But here's a man with a corn pipe in his mouth. You can see you think he's clean and profile. This is his robe. So you have some Islamic traditions that still exist. These are some runaway slave advertisements looking for different Muslims. Kwame, Sambo, two Sambo, and this one on the bottom is looking for a brother named Muhammad. And this is done, I think, 1734. The Waha brothers in North Carolina, the Ben Ishmael tribe out of Illinois and Chicago area. This is the 1790 letter that they did, the translation. This time it was 5 women and 5 men in South Carolina petitioned the government for their freedom. And they won. It became known as the Moorish Sun-Dry Act. This is postage stamps of 2 Muslims that fought in the Revolutionary War. One was Peter Salim, and the other one is Salim Poor. They will say in America, Selim, but if you look in the dictionary, they tell you that Selim word is the Arabic word which means Salim. Another famous Muslim that fought in the Revolutionary War was Yusuf bin Ali. His name was Yusuf bin Ali, but then they changed it to Joseph bin Heli. This bin Heli family still lived there in Sumter, South Carolina area today. They married amongst the Native American Indians in South Carolina. And these are some of the descendants that still live there today. I want to speed up a little bit more. This is an article, a petition to the government. A lot of times you hear in the United States that we are built upon a Judaic-Christian valued nation. We was not. It was built upon the freedom of religion, the freedom from religion, and the freedom for religion. This is an article that stated that there was no antinomy to the Muslim or the Mohammedan religion, is what they state. Here, the first 10 international peace treaties, Morocco was the first country to acknowledge America's freedom and independence. It has the longest peace treaty that still exists today. Out of the first 10 international peace treaties, 5 were done with Muslim countries. Morocco, Libya, Muscat, Libya, and Algiers make up the 10 peace treaties in there. This here is a translation of the document. You have up in here a letter from George Washington to the Sultan of Morocco. A letter from the Sultan of Morocco back to George Washington, asking for, George Washington was asking them to help establish a peace treaty amongst these countries, and they did. Some of the presidents, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, the U.S. diplomats to the Muslim world, they both have Qurans. The first Muslim congressman to take office, he took the oath of office on Thomas Jefferson's Quran. John Adams' Quran is in Massachusetts today. There's towns. By the 1800s, you got a town called Muhammad, Illinois, Muhammad, Texas, Mecca, Indiana. In the middle was some brothers that they called the Azaris, and those are who I really want to get to. This here is a petition of the freedom of a brother named Thomas Hawk. You got Yar Mahmoud living in Georgetown, was a famous Muslim personality, known for praying, having a hauling business. Here is a group, talk about the Gullah people out of South Carolina and Georgia. This here is the first Muslim community that existed in the United States in 1812. One was a leader named Bilali Muhammad. He wrote a risala, a 13-page letter. This letter is in Georgia today. Another leader was named Salih Bilali. And between those two leaders of Bilal's, I found this tombstone with the Tawheed on it, with the one finger. And we know the story about Bilal ibn Rabah during Prophet Muhammad time, study of Islam. When he was tortured by his slave master, all he could say was, "Ahad, then put up the one finger." Well, in America, they took our name, identity, our culture, everything. But there's in our genes, in our genetics, that consciousness is still there. So you find these tombstones from Florida all the way up to Maine, out to Kansas with the Tawheed, and some you'll find even in Arabic. These are what they call tabby rooms, old houses that exist in that community, which they call the chocolate. And it's made out of sand, seashells, and limestone, out of knowledge. The same form of concrete was the same form that they used in Spain and in Morocco to build their homes out of there. This is the area where Bilali is, and this is more stories that they talk about them and describe them. The reason why I'm going fast, because I really want to talk about, and these are some tombstones. This is what the Bilali community, but there's Muslims that fought in the Civil War, and not just African-American Muslims, but Muslims from around the world. These are just documents that we found talking about Bilali, describing them, how they used to pray 3 times a day, saying, I mean, facing towards the rising of the sun. These are some books that talks about their story and their history. Drums and Shadow is a very primary source book that talks about the Gullah people out of South Carolina and Georgia. Slave songs tells you the story and describe Bilal, Muhammad, and Salih Bilali and their family. This is part of the American history. Even while they was enslaved, you see them with Islamic names. You see Ishmael. You see Bilali. You see Barkis is probably Bakir. Fatima, another Muhammad, spelt with the M-O. You got another Muhammad, spelt with a M-A. You can see another Fatima, Benna, Amirta. Michael's probably a Mikhail. You see this Muhammad with an M-E-T. So we've been part of the American fabric. We found Muslims in the census records. One named Muhammad came from Arabia in 1850, living in Ohio. Living in California. We now found another one living in Ohio. Now, here is, as far as the Christian church, you have intersection of Islam, which this here is what they call the ring shout. They couldn't make Hajj, so they make Tawaf. 7 times they make circuits in there. And another thing that they did, they call and respond, which is Islamic tradition. What we do, we call the Adhan, right? Allahu Akbar, Allah, call him, and then we come to prayer, right? If I say Prophet Muhammad, y'all going to say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I say Takbir, you're going to say Allahu Akbar. Call and respond. Is part of this form that they carry on. In the Christian church, you say, can I get an amen? Preach, brother. You know, you hear that call and response. That tradition still exists, still maintained. Oh, man, this is a video showing the making the ring shout. In a church in Savannah, Georgia, all of its pews have this Arabic script written on it. It's called a Jami script. And you can see the houses. They call it Islamic house on Bay Street. You see a brother with a kufi on in there. That's that tombstone. And Abdul Rahman, Muslim Seminole Indians, Harriet Tubman. Now, up in Harriet Tubman, the churches that they talked about, they taught them unique. They was unique because the minaret, and you can see the Islamic arch that's in there. One of the church, they put new windows. But up in here, you still see they did this Islamic design within there. Okay, my time is up. This is Bridgeport. Oh, man, I want to at least give me 2 minutes. That was a tombstone of a Muhammad family, the first Muhammad family. These are runaway slaves. Oh, man. Like this. All right, there it is. These right here are Azoris. They look like Revolutionary War heroes. But they're Muslims in turbans and thobes. You can see it. This is in a museum in Fredericksburg. This here is in, these are Muslims here. You see them dressed all right here. I'm going to end there. All right? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We need you for 2-3 hours. You know?
I know, but that happened.
MashaAllah, so this was meant to be an overview, a very quick overview, as you all see. But there's a lot to digest here, a lot from our tradition that I think we can help, at least, if nothing else, we want to help inform and educate, especially for our coworkers, colleagues, classmates, neighbors, people that may not know any of this. As I mentioned, compared to 30, 40, 50 years ago, there's a lot more research now that's come out that's validated what many of the Muslim traditions have been, had been showing in their texts. So, alhamdulillah, I want to just thank our speakers, and I want to open it up for our Q&A. I believe we have a little bit of time before some question and answer, if there's anything that the audience would like to engage with us with. Don't everybody jump at once.
The floor is yours for questions.
Yeah. I realized it was a bit of a whirlwind for the presentation.
Extreme whirlwind.
Yeah, mashallah.
This needs to be a couple hours panel.
Yeah, we should do a whole seminar. Yes, Brother Wasim. Why? What's not
Do you
brought
have
up?
a mic for him? I can't.
Just a lot of the text and the presence of Islam in the history, especially with the U.S. Coming up to 250 years, what do you think are some of the reasons that we're not seeing this information? I know readily available in school is one thing, but just present in anything we're learning today.
I have an answer, but I...
Go ahead.
Because we haven't told him it. I mean, I have to be honest, right? I was just telling Dr. Douglas, Yusuf Islam has a line in his book that he spent 30 years looking for enlightenment. And the entire time period while he was looking for enlightenment, never once did he hear anything about Islam from a Muslim. And I think that's really, if there's nothing else, what I really hope we get out of these types of efforts, is that this is history. This is now factual. This is not made up. Brother Amir wasn't just showing kind of random things that he concocted together. Dr. Douglas wasn't just mentioning it. But the problem is that story hasn't been told because we are the people that need to be telling that story. It's not just naturally going to come up for people that don't necessarily have a lineage or a heritage there. So in my estimation, we just need to be better about getting that message out there. And I think time will change. It will change over time. I see it in my own children's generation compared to mine, compared to the previous generations, right? But we just need to we need to do the work of really teaching and educating others on the history so that it doesn't begin in 1609 Virginia. Right?
There's another reason, too, and that is that world history used to be taught in the schools as one civilization after another. And what we're trying to do now, and this since the mid-1990s, there has been an opening in the schools to teach what we have to unfortunately call global world history, which means not looking at civilizations as a linear sequence with big emphasis on Western Civ, and there's some pushback on that going on in Texas and other states right now to try to roll that back. But the idea is that you would learn about the civilizations that existed and other societies. It doesn't have to be a contest of whether you can only cover civilizations, right? The idea that you would look at all of the societies era by era and where they interacted, those zones of interaction in the oceans, in the trade routes, and all those kinds of places. That's where you can find out more about those kinds of things, right? But also, the knowledge has been available among scholars for at least 100 years.
Yeah.
The Orientalist, scholars and the people who just went out as Europeans, colonized and learned in order to rule people and whatever, they came in contact with libraries and museums. Archaeology came into its own. And that knowledge came through. They read the books. They read the translations. Some of them translated books and then, brought them out into the public, like Ibn Battuta or the work of various others were brought into English and French and so on. But it's taken 100 years or 75 years at least to get that knowledge into schools, where the public, and into public media and so on. Unity Productions has done a great job, mashallah, in bringing some of this out. And I just wanted to refer to a website where there's a lot more on the history of Islam in America. It's called MuslimPathways.com, where you'll find a lot of the figures that Brother Muhammad was talking about.
Yes, Sister.
Sorry I'm not very good with dates, but when you talk, one of you said about the Dark Ages being connected with the Golden Age.
Yeah.
Is what is referred to as the Dark Ages, is that within Islam also, or is it would they call it the Dark Ages, or is if we're looking at different cultures sort of evolving, for lack of a better term, at concurrent times but in different ways? Is it the Dark Ages in both of those civilizations, or was it knowledge was still going in one and sort of stagnant in the other?
He knows I'm dying to say something. It's not, Dark Ages is not really a thing. Neither is Middle Ages, right? Yeah. These are terms that became popular. The Dark Ages, it was a period, you could say, mostly confined to Europe and the territories that were ruled by Rome, that when the Roman Empire declined, things fell apart. The roads fell into disrepair, and there were also the so-called barbarian invasions and all those kinds of things. So this is the period when the cities declined, trade declined, and Europe was more isolated, right? But it used to be taught as if it was a worldwide thing, but it wasn't. Yeah. And so you get this, what he was talking about in this phenomenon. You had these scholars of the Greek and Roman period that brought out all these classics. And then we used to be taught that nothing happened until the Renaissance anywhere in the world, which is complete nonsense, because during that time, the period from, the millennia before, the whole millennia before 1500, right, there was activity going on all over the place. That was in China was reaching what almost occurred to it as an industrial revolution in the Tang and Song dynasties, right? You had Islam flourishing. So it really isn't a thing. The idea of Middle Ages even means the period between the classics and the modern, right? But that period has often been characterized as, well, when Europeans went out to explore and colonize, they sort of saw they recognized that these civilizations were great, but they saw them as having had a golden age and gone into decline, so that when Europeans encountered them, they were already in decline, right? And then, if anything, that heritage had been passed on to the West, which then sort of took this foundation and ran with it. We try to teach nowadays with an understanding that modernity is the result of the work of common humanity, coming up with with all these sort of inventions and technologies, from writing systems to medicine in general, to weapons technology, the arts of fire. All these things are collective human achievements that were recorded and passed on. That's how we need to understand modernity now, as interactions among societies. And I apologize for jumping in there. But.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is it's funny because historians will look back on time and give it ages. Like when you're in the dark age, you don't know you're in the dark age. When you're in the middle, but now when you look back on it, yeah, you could roughly equate that the dark ages of Europe were actually the golden age of Islam. In that sense, right? Now that's how some historians, right? Yeah. So that's how some historians will say it. I will say, I mean, in general, the two civilizations just had very different trajectories, right? And to be fair, there were still pockets, even though much of Western Europe was living under feudal systems and all of that kind of stuff. There was still a huge center of learning within Constantinople itself. So what would become in 1454, which would be taken over by the Ottomans, right, and the city actually falling, part of the reason that Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, was so important was because there was a seat of knowledge, much of knowledge that from Christianity that was still housed there. When we talk about the Byzantine Roman Empire, we forget to really say that even in the Quran, actually, God refers to the the Romans. He's actually not referring to the Romans in Rome, Italy. He's referring to those who are in Istanbul and Constantinople. The reason for that is because that's where the seat of knowledge of essentially Christianity was. It was no longer in France or Paris, and it was no longer in Rome, in Italy. It had already transferred into that part of the world. It wasn't until after the Ottomans came that some of that knowledge would then go into other parts of Western Europe. So it's just, it's very interesting to see the intersections historically. But unfortunately, to Wasim's point earlier, this is not taught. Oftentimes, it's glossed over at best, and it's not something that is really, Imam Ali, one of our famous scholars, said, a person who has learned history has added ages to their age. Wisdom upon wisdom. And part of our problem today is that we don't really study history. We don't really learn from the past in the way that we used to. One of my teachers, Dr. Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson, he said, any intelligent person can learn from their own mistakes, but a wise person learns from other people's mistakes. And we just don't spend enough time going back into history and analyzing it for what we should be. And this is why, historically, we fall into the same patterns. Right? So I know that we're about to have Salat al-Asr. So for our guests who are here, we are going to be performing the third prayer of the day. So we had one before dawn. We had one at 1:30, which was right after the zenith of the sun. And this is the kind of the afternoon prayer, if you will, which will be prayed at 5:30 here. So that will be, you are welcome to stay. We just ask if you are a guest that you be towards the back of the center to allow the people who will be praying to be towards the front. And we will continue. I think we're actually ending the program, but we'll be around for some Q&A after if anybody is interested. And I want to just, again, thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity, not just to talk a little bit about our history, but our collective. As Dr. Douglas just so beautifully said, this was really a human experience. The transfer of knowledge, the building of civilization is not done by one individual or one group. It is a human experience. And that's exactly what we have to do today, is to continue to build and rebuild on top of our civilization for others. May God bless all of you, and may He continue to grant all of us the best of knowledge, and may He grant us knowledge that is beneficial. May He grant us the ability to see truth as truth and to follow it, and to see falsehood as falsehood and to stay away from it. May He continue to bring our hearts together and in His love and love for His beloved and love for the prophets. May He continue to guide us and increase all of us in guidance. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa barik wa sallimu tasliman كثيرا كثيرا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. جزاكم الله خيرا. Peace be upon all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Also, for those of us who are guests, we are about to have the call to prayer. So if you have not heard this before, this is done 5 times a day. There is a call to prayer. It's a very specific formula that is passed down to us from the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And that call to prayer will just be announced right now. That will be kind of the announcing to the environment and the people around that prayer time is about to come. So please come for prayer.
So we'll need to just get all of this stuff. TV.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله Allah, no respect for Yada. اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت الوسيلة والفضيلة والدرجة الرفيعة وابعث مقاما محمودا للذي وعدته
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
ما شاء الله. جزاك الله خير موسى. يوشع استوى. الحمد لله. صلاة العصر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان الله. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله. الله أكبر. سبحان الله. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحانه. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessing for everyone. Thank you for coming out. As you know, today we had the open house where we invited our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues. MashaAllah, a lot of people came in. Alhamdulillah, we have some guests among us also. But we really wanted to thank our volunteers. You know, our volunteers came in from 10 o'clock to until like 5 o'clock. They are here all day. MashaAllah, they work so hard, put their passions and love to expressing our religion, sharing our thoughts, hearing the dialogue and the feedback from community, from our friends, and we had our politicians came in, MashaAllah. So it was very, very well programmed. A lot of communication and conversation happened. We really hope that we can continue and grow on it. And we really thank especially our volunteers, the young volunteers who put their passion into describing their religion. It was amazing. Thank you so much from bottom of our heart. Really appreciate everybody who came in, all the guests. Thank you for coming in. We really appreciate. Anything that we can do, please give us a feedback. Thank you.
Where did he go for?
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. And just a few other upcoming events. We are showing the NBA Finals Game 5 in Qahwa at 8 o'clock. So if you can make it for that, I don't know, have fun. Maybe the Knicks can win in 5.
Keep us in